Hi, this is Lyle Levitt welcoming you to TribFest 23. I hope you're enjoying this weekend of big ideas and important conversations about the future of our state and our country. No matter who you are or what you believe, please be courteous and respectful to everyone around you. And no matter where you call home, thank you for being here. That's right, even if you're not from Texas, the Texas Tribune Festival wants you anyway.
I'm Garrett Kraft. Welcome to I think will be a great conversation about Ukraine and geopolitics. I'm pleased to be here at the Texas Tribune Festival on the Paramount stage with a very distinguished panel who sort of cover and think about this topic on all sorts of different levels. And my hope today is that we're going to divide our conversation into two parts. One, looking at Ukraine and the state of the war and the state of Russia, and then extrapolate out in the second part of our conversation a little bit about the lessons that we have learned about the state of the world order and geopolitics. So I'm going to start with Congressman, you were in Washington yesterday, and Zelensky heard that you were coming down to the Texas Tribune Festival to talk to us, and he said, I've got to meet with you and bring you up to speed on what's going on. So tell us what you learned in your time with Zelensky yesterday.
I was also in Washington a year ago, and I think that contrast is helpful because I was on the floor of the House as President Zelensky addressed a joint session of Congress. That's a high honor reserved for few heads of state, and he was met rapturously and with a bipartisan consensus. But even then, there were warning signs. A lot of the hard-right Republicans boycotted that address, which is unusual. Fast forward a year, not only was President Zelensky not allowed to address Congress, but Speaker McCarthy was actually too afraid to even meet him in front of the cameras. And so he was escorted in really a side door by Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader, and I met with Zelensky in a hallway and said, Congress will be with you. And he then had a series of meetings, really three distinct messages for three distinct audiences. He met first with US House leadership, and his message there was to emphasize the danger of the situation. Without this aid, we will lose this war. Then met with Senate leadership, who has been more supportive of Ukraine, and counseled patience. I think a lot of Western strategists thought this counteroffensive was going to go faster than it did. And what President Zelensky emphasized is war is hard and uncertain. We can win, we will win, but we need more time. And then finally at the White House, his message was speed. He needs the close air support and he needs the long-range fires to break through these series of entrenchments and allow him to reach the sea.
So let me back up a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of how we got to where we are right now. Igor Krestin, you are a native of Ukraine and now at the Bush Institute. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of the geopolitics that led Putin to, I'm always very careful to not say invade Ukraine last year, but to continue his ongoing invasion in a new phase of Ukraine last year.
President Bush called President Zelensky a good dude, a real Texan, which is, again, shows where we stand. Our perspective, maybe we should start at the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukrainians went to the polls and overwhelmingly voted to break away from the Soviet Union by about a margin of 90%, including in Crimea. where over half the population voted for independence from then the former Soviet Union. As part of that, the Russian military, unlike some of the other republics, stayed in Ukraine, in Crimea, in the city of Sevastopol, where the Black Sea Fleet is based. So they were always there. As part of the breakup of the Soviet Union, Crimea got autonomy, and the Russian military remained there. Then we fast forward to 2004 with the first democratic revolution of a rigged vote against President Viktor, who then became President Viktor Yushchenko, was famously poisoned by the Russians as part of that. 10 years later, Ukrainians went and did that again when they saw that the country was slipping back into the sort of pro-Russian camp, and had their second democratic revolution. So within a decade, one of the few countries that chose democracy, they chose freedom, and they chose European orientation. Clearly, that did not sit well with President Putin, who by that time, he was elected in 2000, or appointed first as a successor, and increasingly became more nationalistic in his rhetoric, and more sort of firm with obviously handling of issues like Ukraine, where he had claimed many times in the past he respected Ukraine's sovereignty and Crimea and so forth. But that clearly changed after the latest democratic revolution. And so what the Russians did is, they straight invaded Crimea from the very basis that the Ukrainians let them use following the Soviet Union. They spilled out and invaded the peninsula, and fomented insurrection in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region, where they installed these puppet governments in these two regions. And then, of course, there were two agreements signed in Minsk, Minsk I and Minsk II, that had various provisions that both sides had to sort of undertake to resolve those issues. None of those involved Crimea, which the Russians never sort of budged on. And then, of course, we come to the invasion, reinvasion of Ukraine, I guess would be the one way, and where Putin sort of threw it all on the table, and the Ukrainians fought bravely back, and prevented what would have been, and frankly, an unthinkable scenario for many of our NATO allies. So where we come with this is that Ukraine is doing NATO's job right now, protecting its eastern flank, even though it's not a part of NATO. And I think we at the Bush Institute, and President Bush certainly thinks they should be part of NATO. In fact, in 2008, President Bush led the effort at the Bucharest summit to make sure Ukraine would have been given a path to NATO. So,
Evelyn Farkas, you have been on the front lines of U.S. diplomacy with Russia and U.S. military policy towards Russia over the last decade. One of the things that really stood out to me in 2021 and 2022 was sort of this disconnect within the Biden administration of them seeing this intelligence of this invasion force building along the border, and sort of everyone saying, like, this would be insane for Putin to invade Ukraine. And that really right up until the last couple of days and weeks before that invasion, people really in disbelief that a land war could break out in Europe in the middle of the 2020s. What was Putin thinking, and why does this matter so much to him?
Well, so I think, as Igor said, what Vladimir Putin was trying to do was to exert control over Ukraine. And frankly, over time, he's really developed a neo-imperial strategy. He wants to reclaim all of the former Soviet territories under the Russian Federation's flag, if you will. He wants to exert pressure, frankly, all over Eastern Europe. He would like a weak or non-existent NATO, because NATO is the only operational military alliance in the world that could stop him from taking over small states using military or political or economic pressure. And so it wasn't working for him in Ukraine. He had Yanukovych, a strong man who was basically pushed out of power by the people in 2014 because he was hedging on whether he was going to take Ukraine into the European Union, and the decision he made was no, and the people went to the streets. There was a transition government. Yanukovych fled to Moscow. And then Putin thought, well, I'm going to seize Crimea and I'm going to start another war. And that was more important, starting the war in Donbass, to create problems for Ukraine, to try to continue to exert influence, to get influence that way. The problem was that he had Poroshenko in power, the Ukrainian president who succeeded sort of in the new democratic phase. And then came Zelensky. And he thought Zelensky, he could control him and create pressure on the Ukrainian system, continue the corruption. And Zelensky said, I'm running, to counter corruption. And he stood up to Putin. And I think Putin started to realize it's not going to work. I'm not going to gain control over Ukraine this way. I need to think about more military force. And ultimately, the invasion happened, one, because he thought it maybe wasn't working, the political pressure. Two, there were a number of other factors. It seems that his intelligence agents, his intelligence officials, gave him a rosy scenario of what would happen when he invaded Ukraine. Same with his military leaders. We don't know how much was influenced, for example, by the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. People have speculated that may have also fed into it, thinking that the United States and the West wasn't going to respond the way that we did. That's certainly possible. I think what's more determinative for Vladimir Putin is probably the sense that it was low risk for him, that his officials told him that the Ukrainians couldn't put up a fight, and of course they did. So we're now at a point where everything depends on Ukraine succeeding. Why? Because Vladimir Putin's vision has not changed. If he gets his way in Ukraine, he will turn around, he will, as I like to say sometimes, but it's not very funny, but he will eat Georgia for breakfast, then Moldova, and then he will challenge NATO, because NATO is the only, again, operational alliance that can stand up to him. And the one other thing I want to say, because there's a lot of people on the left and the right who say, well, why do we care? Let's just let them do what they're doing over in Europe. It's because we are still, the United States is still, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, the number one political, military, and economic power in the world. That means that the bad guys are not going to let us just do our own thing. They have already interfered in our elections. They're continuing to interfere in our politics, they being starting with Russia, but of course China, Iran, North Korea. And so the bad guys won't let us just live our lives. We have to go out in the world and we have to defend ourselves and we have to defend our allies. And finally, my last point, this international system that we set up after World War II to make sure that we don't have World War III. That's the bargain, that nobody is going to invade your country. The borders are sacrosanct. In exchange, you're supposed to look out for the human rights of the people in those countries. It hasn't been a perfect situation, but it's prevented World War III.
And Ambassador, this is an audience, hometown audience for you who knows you as a U.S. Senator, but of course you have a very different set of expertise to bring to this subject from your most recent act in public service as the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, or what we call the permanent representative to NATO. And I wonder if you could set a little bit of the stage for us about, Putin made this terrible miscalculation about how the West would actually respond to his attempt to seize the rest of Ukraine. And in doing so has become the most successful recruiter that NATO has had in a half century. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you have seen in terms of a reinvigorated Western alliance and what this war means and represents to NATO.
Yes, I want to take from Evelyn's point and expand on that. When I was at NATO, our military people they had contacts with the Russian military, and Putin back then was preaching to the military, indoctrinating the military that the worst traitor that Russia's ever had was Gorbachev, because he is the one that gave away the Soviet Union to now what is Russia. And that his goal has been from the beginning to recreate the Soviet Union under the mother Russia. So if you look at that as the backdrop, and people say, well, why is Ukraine important to us? It's important for several reasons. One is, of course, for the reason that we are standing up for human rights, for rule of law, for resilient democracies. But if you look at the security element alone, if we back down, and I think both Xi from China and Putin have looked at what's happened in the last 15 years, and they have seen America say, oh, Crimea, that's a terrible thing, but then we go, well, you know, it's not a big deal. Georgia, 2 provinces gone, terrible thing, but we didn't stick with it. So I think after also the debacle in Afghanistan, I think both Putin with his view of recreating the Soviet Union and Xi from his view of wanting to take Taiwan after what he's done in Hong Kong, said this is our time. We have got now the time to do what we really want to do, and America is going to, they'll protest, but then they'll walk away. What we have done is show we're not walking away. And we must continue to say we're not walking away, both for Europe, and I will make the point for every American. Right now, Putin has been very careful. He's gone into a non-NATO country. He understands Article 5. He understands that if he puts one foot into a NATO country, that it is going to be World War III. American troops will be on the ground and in the air and in the space. And so he's being careful. But if he sees that we will protest and then walk away, then the next step is it's Belarus, then it's Moldova, and then it is into a NATO country. So if we want our troops not to fight in another foreign war, we stick with Ukraine right now, and we show we are going to see it through to the end. For Xi, also, we have to make that point that we are taking a stand and we will not walk away. So it's big for our overall security, and NATO sees that. I saw a sea change in, for instance, Germany. After the invasion, Scholz turned on a dime to say, we're stopping the Nord Stream XL pipeline, which should have been stopped a long time ago. And he started saying, finally, that they would give tanks, that they would give armor, which he had never done before. Now, they're not doing as much as we would like. We need to continue to urge our European allies to do more, but they are doing a lot. And I always told the people who didn't really think NATO was that important, look, if you want Europeans to be like us, you'll always be disappointed. Europeans will not assess a risk and then deter against it. Only America will do that. So we must lead the security that is going to be our umbrella, and it is going to be in the American interest. And last point, it is so important that NATO is now saying a risk to one of us is a risk to all. And so they've invited 4 Asia-Pacific partners, heads of state, to the summits now for the 2nd straight year. And the allies that have been very good allies are now becoming much more interoperable. That would be South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And so that's the beginning of both an economic and a security alliance that NATO is leading, because we know that with unity, we will be able to defeat the adversaries, and America will lead.
Congressman, my background is as a magazine editor, and I couldn't help but notice that the title of our session today had no punctuation to it, that it is worth fighting for, no question mark at the end, that this is an assertion, and certainly in the way that Igor and Evelyn and the ambassador have laid out, like this seems like a no-brainer geopolitically that we should be supporting Ukraine. And I think if you went back and asked the Pentagon 5 years ago if they could write a check for $50 billion and reduce by half Russia's military capability to project force for the next generation, the Pentagon would have taken that deal and considered that money very well spent. You come from a place in Washington that is related to reality, but a parallel universe that doesn't necessarily see these issues in the same way that our three speakers here have laid out. I wonder if you could sort of walk us through how has this become such an issue of controversy on Capitol Hill, and what are the dynamics that are playing out in this question of worth fighting for, question mark?
The House of Representatives is dysfunctional right now. It's not working. And without boring our audience with continuing resolutions and rule votes and caucus dynamics, what it comes down to is fear. Kevin McCarthy, the Republican Speaker of the House, has what I call the crocodile caucus, based on the old aphorism that an appeaser is someone who feeds a crocodile hoping it'll eat him last. He's feeding the crocodile. He feeds them the Constitution on January 6th. He feeds them the president with his impeachment inquiry. He's trying to feed them Ukraine by divorcing Ukrainian aid from the continuing resolution. The crocodile is never going to be satiated. They will eat Kevin McCarthy. And unfortunately, he doesn't have the savviness to understand that. And so he's driving our House, our chamber, and unfortunately our government off an edge right now. The problem with that is that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping can smell that fear. Not only is Kevin McCarthy too afraid to support democracy overseas, he's too afraid to actually govern our democracy right here at home. And that fear promotes exactly the instability that my guests have been so eloquent in describing how NATO was designed to thwart. The good news in that bleak assessment is that although we do have a MAGA problem, we do not have a math problem. We have 320 votes right now to do everything we have to do. We can fund the government, we can support Ukraine, we can do disaster relief, we can do a continuing resolution to give ourselves time to get it all sorted out. The votes are there. And that's why I was able to tell President Zelensky yesterday morning that Congress will be with you. We're going to do all the wrong things first, but ultimately we will get to the right thing. If you look inside the GOP House conference right now, it's three camps. The first camp, call it the Reagan camp. They're more senior, chair of Intel, chair of Armed Services, chair of Foreign Affairs. They get it. They're with Ukraine, strategic and moral imperative. You got the Trump camp. 30 to 50 members tend to be more junior, freshman and sophomore members. They're openly pro-Putin in their sympathies. They buy into the blood and soil ethno-nationalism of Putin's authoritarian streak, and they don't want to see Ukraine win. They'll dress it up in different intellectualisms, but at the end of the day, they just don't want to see Ukraine win. And then finally, there's the middle camp. And the middle camp is the one that actually we have to pay attention to. The middle camp, as individual members of Congress, will tell me privately, I get it, we got to do this. And in fact, they will say that they are embarrassed by their hard right. But their base back home follows Marjorie Taylor Greene on Twitter and watches Tucker Carlson and cares what Donald Trump thinks about the world, and they are torn. And the challenge over the next 12, 24 months is to keep that middle camp on board. And that's going to be a challenge for the White House, for the Senate, for the House. I have been trying to make inroads with them and figuring out how we keep their political capital sustained.
A question now that I'd sort of like to ask all of you at once is, if we agree that Ukraine is worth fighting for, do we want Ukraine to win? And that is actually not as simple a question as it sounds at first. The British government has been very clear in saying we want Ukraine to win. The Biden administration has not actually said at any point we want Ukraine to win. So let me put that to you both as do we want Ukraine to win? And if we do, what does that winning actually look like? And we'll start with Ambassador.
Well, absolutely, Ukraine must win. What winning is going to, I think, require is that we give the weapons that we know are a real offense. We've always been very careful to have all defense and not even allowing the use of our weapons to go into Russia, for instance, where the bases are launching the drones that are killing Ukrainians and just completely destroying the infrastructure of the country. So I think that we have to let Ukraine fight. We have to not give them half a loaf and half a loaf and half a loaf. We need to give them the weapons that will allow them to win decisively. Because the only way Putin's going to come to the table, if at all, is if there's strength. If he really is, I mean, now he's going to North Korea, for God's sakes, to get weapons. Not to mention that he's already been to Iran. And so I think it's going to take letting Ukraine really fight with the weapons that they need to be able to fight. Now, this is personal. I'm sure there will be a lot of disagreement, but I think we ought to be able to let them take out the Russian bases that are launching missiles and launching drones that are killing the Ukraine people who have been so valiant to stand up. They are fighting this war with their people. They haven't asked for an American soldier, and I want to keep it that way. So I want to give them everything that we can, along with the Europeans who are doing a lot. They're not doing as much as we are, but they're doing a lot. And we need to give them the arms and the air power and the missile power to win decisively.
Evelyn, you're nodding.
Well, I'm agreeing with the ambassador, Senator Bailey Hutchison. You know, we have a situation where we need Ukraine to win. It's existential for us and the world. You heard her also talk about the linkage to China. I mean, these other authoritarians are watching, and they will be emboldened if Putin gets his way. So we really are looking at a worst case scenario if Russia is not defeated. And perhaps that's the problem, that when you say you want Ukraine to win, you should also be comfortable saying, we want Russia to be defeated. It's not defeating the Russian people per se, it's defeating this aggressive foreign policy of Vladimir Putin. It has to be defeated. And now the hesitancy there is perhaps the fear of what comes next after Vladimir Putin, because if Russia's foreign policy is defeated, that means a political defeat, frankly, for Vladimir Putin. In the Russian system, anytime they won a war, the leader, who was the leader at the time, has disappeared from the stage. We don't know what will come next, and so that makes leaders of other countries nervous. I don't think we should fear what will come next. With the exception of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was marching on Moscow and would have been worse than Putin, possibly, or probably, it's hard to imagine a leader being much worse than Vladimir Putin among his inner circle right now. And there's a possibility for other change. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the famous oil mogul who was imprisoned for over a decade by Vladimir Putin, got his freedom and just recently wrote a book about a path that he sees for a more free and democratic Russia. It won't be easy, and maybe it's pie in the sky, but either way, we can't be afraid of what comes next. And the other part of it is that we can't be afraid of what happens to the Russian Federation, because we know that when we were afraid of what would happen to the Soviet Union, and I'm looking at poor Igor because President Bush was criticized for being cautious about that and called Chicken Kyiv at the time. The first one, I know, not the second one. Because it's a natural thing, you're comfortable with the system that's in place, and you're nervous about what will happen if there's fracturing. The idea is, generally speaking, fracturing involves conflict, armed conflict. But many Russians tell me, don't worry. They say, if the transition is made properly, if the deals are made to give more power to the federal areas, that perhaps there won't be bloodshed. And ultimately, it's not really up to us to tell the people living in the former Soviet Union how they should organize themselves. We just want to defeat this evil foreign policy.
Congressman, let me come to you on this sort of second part of this question about what it would take for Ukraine to win. Zelensky showed up in Washington this week. He has a long and growing, but also not necessarily shrinking shopping list of Western arms and systems. What do you think we should be doing that we're not? What is the next chapter of this? What does it take to actually drive this war towards a conclusion?
First of all, I agree with what both of them just said. A couple of thoughts there. One is we should not be exclusively oriented towards land. A lot of times you'll see in the Times and the Journal, they're calculating what percentage of land has been reclaimed by Ukraine, and it's 17%, and here's how much they still have in the Donbass and elsewhere. We should be more oriented towards water. Ukraine is not going to be a viable political economy without unimpeded access to the Black Sea. And that, to me, is part of what makes them viable and part of what a secure peace would be, is that they, not just for grain, but for their entire industrial complex, need to be able to access the Black Sea and need to be able to threaten Russian assets in the Black Sea. And that has been a real place of innovation for Ukraine's military, is their use of unmanned maritime systems to do that. And I expect we're going to see a lot more of that in the next 6 to 12 months. They obviously need ironclad security guarantees. We can debate Article 5 or some kind of complex of bilateral and multilateral commitments, but it's got to be a lot tougher than it was in 2014 and 2008, et cetera. And then finally, they're going to need money. And the good news is, one, there's been a huge return on investment in the money we've already spent. For less than Americans spend on soft drinks every year, we have cratered half of Russia's conventional military capacity and doubled NATO's border. So it's been a good investment. We should continue doing it. But we also have about $300 billion of Russian money sitting here in the United States that can be legally repurposed, both the interest and the principal, to help the Ukrainian people through legal restitution for a barbaric and unprovoked invasion. And that money needs to be put to work, not just when the conflict is over, but I would argue before the conflict is over, to help them have a sustainable economy outside of the war zone.
And what does that look like to you?
The sustainable economy part? Or?
What does that additional level of aid that we should be providing right now look like?
Well, it's economic and military. So $24 billion, let's start with the $24 billion that the president has asked for. That's both economic and military. But we know that's not going to be the last tranche. We're going to continue to provide it. And it's going to be both U.S. taxpayer and, as I said, I think should be from the frozen assets. The other side of this, though, is not just helping Ukraine. It's also strangling the Russian war economy. And there, the price caps on Russian oil that the Secretary of the Treasury coordinated with our allies have been hugely effective, probably costing the Russian war economy about $5 billion a month. Not perfect. They're still using a shadow fleet to get, to maybe evade about a third of the sanctions. But we can tighten them up pretty effectively by whitelisting firms that can attest that they've got the right insurance, and also, frankly, by asking our new partner, India, to be a little tougher. They have increased their imports of Russian oil by, I think, 30 times over the last year, and they're pumping hard currency into the Kremlin's war coffers right now.
Igor, Evelyn sort of began to touch on this question of the future of Putinism. And of course, we lived through this incredibly strange series of developments this spring and summer with Yevgeny Prigozhin's march on Moscow, and then in a very classic and very seemingly predictable moment in a year when sort of oligarch after oligarch has fallen down the stairs or fallen out of a window or fallen off of his yacht. Yevgeny Prigozhin's entire plane fell out of a window. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about how this war ends for Putin. Because I think one of the things that Ukraine has been, and Zelensky will sort of say in sort of smaller circles, is that they don't necessarily think that Ukraine wins this by sort of retaking every square inch of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine wins this by sort of destabilizing Russia to the point that there is a political change inside Russia that sort of causes the collapse of the Russian invasion. And so tell us a little bit about that landscape and sort of where you see this playing out.
Is this, okay, I've got my mic on. Well, thanks, Garrett. Let me make a very quick comment on a previous question, which I agree with all the speakers. Ukraine has agency in this question. Ukraine will not stop fighting. They will not stop innovating. The Black Sea, the cruiser was sunk by Ukrainian long-range missile. They will innovate. In fact, a lot of the industrial capacity of the Russian military was based in Ukraine until very, very recently. It was factories in Kharkiv and Dnipro and other cities that were supplying the Russian military with these very weapons that they've turned around and used in Ukrainians. Ukrainians not only had nuclear weapons, they had long-range missiles and fighters that they sold back. Various governments of Ukraine made the decision to sell those back. So Ukraine has those capabilities. And they will not, these red lines, and we go back on the ATACMS and these other systems, the Ukrainians will hit Russia because they think that that's where the threat is coming from. They'll find ways to do it. They'll MacGyver it in some way. And this is another factor of, I think this administration, as many others, wanted to see peace much quicker, but, Ukraine is not prepared to trade its territory for peace that they know will not be lasting. Putin will come back. And if we think otherwise, in 1997, the Chechens came to the Kremlin to sign a peace agreement. And they thought that would be the end of the story. 2 years later, Putin and the FSB set bombs in apartment buildings around Russia and blamed it on the Chechens, went back in, and those peace agreements, they were called Khasavurt agreements, probably, lay in some dusty corner now. And that's what happened to the Budapest Memorandum, the previous security agreement. So I'm just make a very quick comment on that. About Prigozhin, I agree with Evelyn's point that I don't know if Prigozhin's coup would have been a good thing for Ukraine or the free world, given that he was basically a warlord, and I think really was disillusioned from the right. He was disillusioned that Putin was not winning this war in a way that Prigozhin, who was in there, in the Donbass, saw the fighting, was in Bakhmut, filmed videos of rooms full of dead Russian mercenaries, that Wagner's a mercenary group, and blamed the two people that I think ultimately led to his demise, Defense Minister Shoigu and the Chief of Staff of the Army, Gerasimov, and publicly blamed them. And then really, challenged Putin's leadership, and that was unheard of. And so that coup was, one of almost something out of kind of a movie, and it didn't end well for Prigozhin. It put Putin in a position where he had to give what I think is the most humbling speech I've ever seen him give about Russian history and how we've torn each other apart. And you could see the fear, you could feel the fear there that he knew this was real. And I think people who didn't think it was real, but for some reason, Prigozhin turned around, stopped, and then suffered the fate that he suffered. I think where we go next from that is to understand, what is happening around Putin's inner circle. And I don't think we have a whole lot of understanding about the dynamics that are playing out there and what Putin himself perceives as a threat to his own power. We think in our sanctions policy, I'm sorry, that these oligarchs will certainly come, to understanding that these sanctions, and that hasn't really played out in the way we thought it would. The oligarchs really haven't sort of, they've gone with the program largely. I mean, some of them, like I'm thinking of Mikhail Friedman, who was, a big banker. He's now living sort of almost in an exile situation in London, and he's been stripped of most of his assets, and I certainly support giving it to all of it to Ukraine. To the extent that he influences Putin's thinking about the war in Ukraine, I think is very minimal. So we need to really understand those dynamics, and the Prigozhin thing told us that we really don't. But ultimately, I turn it back to Evelyn's comment, is that it is our hope that at some point there is a power dynamic in Russia that recognizes the grave harm that Putin's decision to reinvade, to fully invade Ukraine has done to Russian Federation's strategic interests themselves. And I think that's the imperial mindset. There was a story about Putin, during COVID, being isolated from the world, going and reading in a bunker a bunch of history, and really, because he's not challenged in power. To your question of what Putin fears, I think he fears the Gaddafi and the Saddam Hussein scenario, or the maybe closer history, the Nicolae Ceausescu scenario. I think that's his biggest fear. And much like, Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, regime survival is the main goal of President Putin. And he thought he would strengthen that by invading Ukraine because he thought that would be over quickly. He would be in much stronger strategic position vis-a-vis NATO and the European Union, and that has played out very poorly for him.
Congressman, Ambassador Hutchinson touched on the sort of lessons that Xi Jinping is taking from the war in Ukraine, both from Putin's side and from the Western side. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that question and how the U.S., sort of what lessons the U.S. should be taking from this conflict with Ukraine to apply to the next decade of geopolitics with China.
I agree with the analogy, and I think a host of senior Indo-Pacific diplomats that we've met with as part of my role on the Select Committee on Competition with China would agree, from Australia to Singapore to Philippines to Japan and South Korea. Everyone is seeing the connection. In Russia, you've got a fellow Slavic people who are demonstrating that you can have a thriving democracy that's Western aligned. It's an intolerable counterexample for the autocrat in the Kremlin. In Taiwan, you have a fellow ethnic Han people that are demonstrating a thriving democracy aligned with the West. That is an intolerable counterexample for the autocrat in Beijing. And in both places, they're more keyed in to the effect it could have on their domestic politics than they are necessarily internationally. So there's absolutely analogies there. And as I tell my GOP colleagues on the Select Committee on China continuously, you all claim you are tough on China. If you are weak on Russia, you are weak on China. They are linked. Xi Jinping is watching very closely what happens in Ukraine because deterrence matters and alliances matter. That's why the South Korea and Japan rapprochement is such a big deal. That's why AUKUS with Australia is such a big deal. That's why the Quad should become, I think, ultimately the basis for an Asian NATO. This is where we need to be headed.
Ambassador, NATO is literally the North Atlantic Alliance. But as you have already said, and as the Congressman is alluding, sort of much of its future appears to focus on the Indo-Pacific. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see those dynamics playing out, and what lessons do we take from the way that NATO has survived and thrived for almost 80 years at this point, and apply them to this new set of relationships that we have brewing between AUKUS and the Quad and other alliances in the Indo-Pacific?
I think NATO, one thing that NATO has done through its 75 years is adapt to the common risks that we have. And it's been really Russia, because that was the European area of operation. But I think watching the rise of China's aggression, whether it is Huawei or theft of intellectual property, we were instrumental in putting China into the World Trade Organization, hoping that they would then become a rules-based order and be a fair competitor. That's what we would want. They have not done that. And instead, you have seen aggression and buildup of the military. So I believe NATO has adapted again, and in the summit of 2019 or 20, maybe it was 20, we declared that we would be going into the Asia Pacific in an effort to make sure that we are deterring against our risk, our common risk, China. And I think now that is accepted. And I think what's going to happen is that the four Asia, it's not the Quad, but India's in the Pacific Quad for us, and we need, I thought the Congressman made a very good point, we need to really, really focus on the importance that India should place on being in the Western Alliance, to being in an awareness. They're the one country that has actually been attacked up in the Himalayas in the northern sector. The Chinese soldiers brutally killed Indian soldiers with no provocation whatsoever, and in violation of a treaty they had of non-aggression. So it's very important that we all come together and do more interoperability, more sharing of information. Australia and New Zealand have been such strong partners. Maybe a lot of people don't realize that we have 40 partners already in NATO. We have 31 allies, but we have 40 partners. And every one of those partners has been in our common missions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, even in Europe, in Kosovo. So we have a very strong presence in Middle East, and we need to do more in South America. That's a whole other issue that I would really like to take on at some time. But we need to have these alliances. NATO is on it. Jens Stoltenberg is the leader that has kept the coalition together and moved out with America's leadership to looking at the bigger picture. And I think we will continue that. There will be the summit next year in Washington, the 75th anniversary. NATO's already the longest standing political military alliance in the history of the world. I think this move out into Asia for stronger partnerships is going to continue the importance of NATO. And I cannot emphasize enough that America is the leader of NATO. We are, and when President Macron says something like NATO is brain dead, France will be the nuclear umbrella of Europe, every other European ambassador to NATO came to my door and said, no, don't let that happen. So believe me, the other European countries want us to be that leader because they know that we really have the interest of everyone. We're not parochial on small things. So I think NATO is here to stay. It will continue to get stronger. And believe me, it is in America's interest that we have 30 partners and 40 allies, 30 allies and 40 more partners, because that is our deterrence against aggression by any other country, and especially one that has the capability to draw us into a military conflict.
We're going to open it up to questions. If you want to be sending in whatever questions you may have on the off chance we have not answered every single aspect of this topic in the last 45 minutes. But let me come to Evelyn with one more point on this, which is when we were talking backstage about this subject of sort of where these geopolitics go over the next decade, you made the point that a big part of this question about Russia, about China, about the future of the international order, actually isn't a European question at all. Isn't really even an Indo-Pacific question, but it's a question of the global South. And I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about how you see the global South fitting into this evolving international order.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Not last week, Monday and Tuesday, I was in New York for a Clinton Global Initiative meeting because the McCain Institute is part of a small group trying to help Ukraine. And I watched and listened, and the president, of course, came out and started his speech with Vietnam, ended with Ukraine, but in the middle he talked about the existential threat we all face, which is the environment, which is what we should be talking about here if it weren't for those bad guys that we have to deal with. We have no choice. And for the Global South, they don't really perceive what's at stake for them here. And I think that's one thing that we need to do better at. You know, there are a lot of things we talked about up here that we could do better, or that our government could do better to help Ukraine. But frankly, the Global South, they have as much to lose, especially smaller states, of course, because what Putin wants is a sphere of influence situation where big states can dictate to smaller states. And so this neo-imperial foreign policy, it has to be revealed as such to the states that are fence-sitters. You know, India is an example, which is, you know, it's full of contradictions. Vietnam, Indonesia, many of these countries, they understand what Russia and China are doing and what their objectives are, but they don't see it quite in the same neo-imperial lens and don't understand that it could come home to hit them. Same with, of course, the countries in Africa and in Latin America. So we just need to do a better job explaining to them that the entire international order and therefore their security is at stake here.
Yes, audience questions.
Yes. This first one is for Ambassador Hutchison. Given that our intelligence indicated that what Putin was planning, could or should we have done more to prevent a war in the first place?
To prevent the invasion in the first place? You know, I think here's where I would give the Biden administration a plus, and that is by seeing the intelligence and publicizing it, I thought was very good, because that was what we were trying to tell Putin. We know what you're doing. This is really a mistake. And I think that was something that was very important, and I think it did help because even in Ukraine, they were not believing it until we just said, the administration said, they're going to invade. And boy, I could see in the Olympics, when she and Putin met, you could tell that she was saying, just please wait till after the Olympics are over. And boy, it was the day after, and he did it. So I think we did that. What more could we have done? I think we threatened in every way Russia about doing this. We told Russia, both inside and publicly, if you do this, NATO is going to be united. And short of all of that, you know, what more could we have done? I'm not sure, but I do think there was an effort.
For Ms. Farkas, could the U.S. sustain fighting two major world adversaries simultaneously if China were to invade Taiwan?
Well, I think I'm a political scientist and not a military commander, but clearly we do have in our planning to try to deter China and obviously to deter Russia. As far as fighting two major wars, I think that would be a challenge, but I wouldn't test the United States on that. We have learned a lot through watching Ukraine about war fighting and about how to use some new technology. And we've also learned that sometimes we paint the enemy to be bigger and stronger and more fearsome than it actually is. So, and I put myself in that camp because I was President Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and I believed that the Russians were building and modernizing, and it turns out that there was so much corruption that the modernizing wasn't actually consistent across the board. Yes, they produced some good missiles, but they didn't do anything about logistics and command and control, and it may well be that that's the same problem once we, you know, if we were to, God forbid, face China in a military scenario, that they would face the same problem because there is also corruption in the Chinese Communist Party and in the People's Liberation Army and Navy. So, but having said that, again, I think what we are trying to do, I don't like the question, and I'm almost done, because we are trying to avoid war with Russia right now by helping Ukraine win its war really fast. And that will also help us avoid any kind of war with China. What we would like is a cooperative competition if we have to be competitive with China. And so we are not looking, in being firm, we're not looking for war, it's actually the opposite.
Let me sort of stay on this point, though, with the Congressman. In an impossible 1 minute or less answer, what does the U.S. deterring China from invading Taiwan look like? You're thinking a lot about this on your select committee with the competition with China. What should the U.S. be doing sort of concretely that we are either not doing or need to be doing?
So first, timeline, we have to get to the next 10 years. The next 10 years of the danger zone. Xi Jinping has indicated that he wants to see reunification in his lifetime. He's in his young 70s right now, so the next 10 years, he's purportedly told the PLA, be ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan. So we got some really tense years coming up against us. Number one, we got to arm Taiwan. There's debates about the porcupine strategy versus more high-tech equipment. Both. I mean, we got to arm Taiwan so that every morning when Xi Jinping wakes up, he looks across the straits and he says, not today. Two, alliances really matters. The Australians, probably the most important, but South Koreans and Japanese, critical as well. And we, with our allies, do not want to just send a strong military deterrent, but also preload economic sanctions so that he understands in a way that we probably did not communicate well enough to Russia just how effective the economic sanctions and devastating they will be.
All right, sorry.
This is also for the representative. What do you tell your Republican colleagues who are skeptical about continuing to help Ukraine? And what do you think a second Trump presidency, how that would impact financially supporting Ukraine?
Why don't you stick with the second one, because I feel like we've already answered the first one.
So at this point, I think Vladimir Putin's entire strategy in Ukraine boils down to two words, which is Trump wins. If Trump wins and he cuts and runs from Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has a chance. Otherwise, I think Ukraine will win. And that needs to be the unequivocal mission of NATO there. Donald Trump was the worst president in American history, and his second term would be even worse. I don't even know how else to say it.
And for Mr. Creston, can the U.S. government or our allies provide Ukraine with dependable communications infrastructure that is not dependent on the whims of people like Elon Musk?
Boy, that's we should, and Starlink continues to be a big asset to both the Ukrainian military and obviously its people, especially in areas that have been reclaimed and communication has been destroyed. I certainly think we shouldn't let Mr. Musk decide military value of a certain operations and turn off those communication systems. And if the Pentagon can figure out a way to square that circle, and I think that I've seen some recent reporting that they have figured out some ways where that's no longer going to be the case, then I think we'll be in a good spot. I think technology is the way to win this war. Innovation is the way to win this war. So we need more of that, and we need those very cutting-edge technologies and sharing that with Ukrainians and who've been incredibly quick, agile, adept learners. That's how we're going to win this war. So, thank you.
Last question? Okay. Let me pick up then this, because I think that this is like a really interesting subject. And ask sort of one final question. And I want to put this both to Ambassador Hutchinson and the Congressman. Elon Musk is this fascinating sort of independent geostrategic player right now. And we have meaningful geopolitical risk with him, both in terms of Russia and Starlink and Ukraine, but then also in terms of China and the ownership of Twitter and what that means for Tesla auto sales and access to the Chinese market. How would you, if you were chair of the Congressional Select Committee on competition with Elon Musk, what would you be thinking about in terms of recommendations for the US government and how we sort of disentangle US geopolitical strategy from the personal whims of Elon Musk?
The United States Agency for Global Media needs to build a Starlink for China.
Ambassador, any thoughts there?
Well, I think that's the right point. And I think the Department of Defense, as I understand it, is doing that. They are working on the communication system that would be secure. And that's important because your military operation has to come from the military and the administration. So that I think is in the works already with Ukraine, and I don't think Elon Musk would disagree with that. I think he came in early and really helped the Ukraine.
It's complementary, just like how he's working SpaceX with NASA, right? I mean, we need both. It's fine that he has Starlink, but I agree with your central point that it can't be single-threaded. Whatever he's tweeting shouldn't decide Ukrainians' telecom strategy, right? Like we need, or I guess Xing now, whatever it's called. We gotta have a public function to do that, and it shouldn't just be a Starlink for China in the sense of allowing free flow of information there. We also need to be better, as the Chinese are, at seeding, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, local news. They are getting very good at host country language news media that is swaying public opinion, particularly in Indonesia, and we've got to be there blow for blow.
All right, closing
I
thought.
know our time is up, but I want to say how much I appreciate TribFest bringing people in from all over the country, and it's very balanced, trying to have this for our Texans, but also throughout the country. And I welcome all of you, and I'm so glad to see this audience that's interested in coming to hear us. And thank you, TribFest, and thank you, Texans.
And join me in thanking our panel today.